Level up your firm's productivity, cash flow, and client satisfaction with LawPay. Capture more billable time with start and stop timers, simplify billing by creating invoices using the time tracking entries you log, and streamline payments with online debit, credit, and e-check payment offerings and pay later legal fee financing, which provides your firm with the full payment upfront while clients pay over time. Give your firm LawPay and get a $250 gift card when you sign up by the end of the month and process $500 in your first 30 days. Terms and conditions apply. Learn more by visiting lawpay.com/dcbar. Throughout the year, you work hard to ensure the best client service and win over your competition. This giving season, give your practice the tools to grow with MyCase Plus LawPay. More than 17,900 legal professionals choose MyCase Plus LawPay to streamline payments, automate repetitive tasks, and free up time for what matters most, delivering outstanding client outcomes. Get 25% off MyCase Advanced plus a $250 gift card when you process $500 in your first 30 days with LawPay. Terms and conditions apply. Learn more by visiting mycase.com/dcbar. Treat your personal injury firm to CasePeer this holiday season. From intake to document creation, CasePeer simplifies your firm's workflow, improves client experiences, and reduces admin tasks. And when you complete a live demo this month, you'll get a $50 gift card. Terms and conditions apply. Book your demo and claim your gift at www.casepeer.com.
Welcome to the DC Bar's Brief Encounters podcast. I am Tilly Moore, Chair of the Human Rights and Immigration Subcommittee of the International Law Community at the DC Bar. This is the second of our speaker series on international principles and standards that govern democratic elections in this historic year of elections, a year in which over 80 countries are holding national elections, affecting more than half the world's population. Today, we will speak with two experts in the elections and governance sector to discuss global election standards with a focus on Europe. Europe held 9 parliamentary elections in 2024, with several predicted to result in notable change in government or policy direction, from Russia to France, Germany, Austria, Spain, Portugal, the UK, to the European Parliament representing 27 EU countries, to Eurasia with Georgia and Uzbekistan. We're also a couple of weeks since the US elections here, and we will talk about how that went from a global standards perspective. We're privileged today to host two distinguished guests that will help sort out some of those global and European electoral standards. Dr. Beata Rozumilowicz is an electoral expert with more than 20 years of experience globally. She served on numerous European Union election observation missions, headed the election department of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, based in Warsaw. She has also served as the Director for Europe and Eurasia and Technical Advisor for Technology in Elections with the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES. And we have Julia Brothers, Deputy Director for Elections at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. Julia has worked in dozens of countries worldwide, leading electoral assessments and electoral integrity projects, and brings significant experience in post-conflict and transitioning democracies. She's also an expert in process and results verification for transparency, formerly known as parallel vote tabulation, and open election data, voter registration, observer rights, and the role of new technologies and digital media in electoral processes. Welcome to you both. Now that's quite a mouthful, and I would love it if you could each share a little bit about your path of what drew you and influenced you to work in elections around the world. Maybe we could start with you, Beata.
Great. Thank you very much for having me and to have such an interesting discussion. So my background, my parents were war refugees during the Second World War and were displaced and ended up growing up under a communist regime where they had very little freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the ability to make choices about their own lives. And when they finally immigrated to the United States, where I was born, it was something that was really inculcated in us from childhood to be able to express ourselves freely, to be able to make choices for our lives, to be able to express ourselves politically. And it's really a value that I hold very deeply and really think should be the founding point for societal decisions across the world. something that I've worked to achieve throughout my career.
That's really inspiring, that sort of intergenerational continuity of values. Julia, would you like to tell us about how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Yeah. I definitely started more on the campaign and electoral politics side of things, especially working on women's rights, and got started at Emily's List, which helps elect pro-choice Democratic women to state and national office in the US. And then, shifted to more of a nonpartisan view of the electoral process and how important that is. Since then, I worked at NDI for a very long time, but I've also done quite a bit of work on nonpartisan election reform in the US itself, especially on the voter registration process and making sure that that works for all citizens in the US. So I think, there's certainly the kinds of experiences that we have, and this kind of comparative knowledge I think is really important, because no election is perfect and there's a lot to learn from country to country, including, for the US as well.
Speaking of learning from country to country, Julia, so this year going into 2025 has been called the super elections year, right? With more elections than ever before. What is your sense so far about this historic year of elections? How has it been going, essentially, right? But specifically because of our topic today, how do you think these elections have been aligned with international standards for democratic elections?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think for me, every year is a year of elections. I do think it's kind of difficult sometimes when we try to quantify these things. I'm not, I know this was a big media headline, but I'm not totally convinced that this year actually had any more elections than we usually see, especially because in some cases, you're talking about elections in places that are not genuine and are not competitive, right? Like in Russia and some of these other countries that did hold elections this year, but in air quotes. But also, there's always snap elections that you can't predict, that will always kind of, pop up and fill up a cycle. And, we're also not even talking about local elections, right? Which oftentimes have the most impact, right, on citizens' lives. But I think that said, it's been a roller coaster of a year. I think one thing that we know for sure is that elections can still have unexpected outcomes. They still do provide, the opportunity for democratic change and democratic renewal. That said, I think when we look at some of the trends, a lot of elections this year certainly fell short of meeting international standards. And I think we're seeing democratic backsliding continue to happen in a number of places. And what I would consider, some pretty blatant manipulation of the legal framework or of international standards that do undermine the kind of the transparency and accountability and competitiveness of the process, which I'm happy to talk about in more detail.
Yeah, I would love it if you could sort of point us to one or two examples where you've seen maybe something like you've mentioned, sort of the manipulation, but also in a place where maybe there was a surprise about aligning or realigning with international standards.
Yeah, I think, one of the big, I would say kind of one of the big trends, unfortunately, of this year is that traditional authoritarian tactics sort of continue to be the largest electoral integrity threat. So again, sort of weaponization of the legal framework or other machinations of the state to limit transparency and or the competitiveness of the process. So, in Venezuela, we saw before the elections, opposition operatives and candidates were jailed. They were denied access to be on the ballot. And then, of course, we saw manipulation of the results after election day. Similarly in Tunisia, they just had elections earlier in October. All the opposition candidates were jailed before the elections. Credible civil society organizations were denied accreditation to observe the elections for the first time since the Arab Spring. In places like Georgia, which I'm sure Beata will talk a little bit more about, these kind of very repressive NGO laws were put in place in the pre-election period. That was really designed to kind of have a chilling effect on groups being able to provide transparency and accountability around the process. We're seeing something similar happen in Turkey now, these kind of foreign agent laws that are becoming quite pervasive. And so, I think this has been a sort of a discouraging trend. That said, I think one thing that we have learned is how credible institutions really matter. So in places where, where elections have, the process has gone unexpectedly smoothly or where there's been sort of democratic change. A lot of this has been rooted in, EMBs, election management bodies, having, high levels of trust from citizens, having, being able to withstand political pressure. The quality of the judiciary, for instance, in South Africa, they had kind of wild elections this year. A number of cases were thrown to the courts constantly about, a ballot qualification and other issues. And I think the fact that they have a judiciary system there that is well respected and generally trusted really helps kind of keep the guardrails on a really contentious election. So, we are certainly seeing, there are these bright spots. I think, Senegal had fairly, after the elections had been extra legally postponed in a very dramatic way, those elections ultimately did see a change of power. The same thing, in South Africa, there was the ruling party lost a significant number of seats that it hadn't had before. Sri Lanka, recently had kind of a big election. Moldova, of course, just occurred. And while, that was certainly a more competitive and contentious election than I think people anticipated. But again, I think these are all examples of, again, the importance of these strong and incredible institutions to continue to move the process forward.
There's always, right, the positive and the negatives and how they all play out in sort of this geopolitical context. I wonder, Beata, if you could sort of elaborate on what Julia was starting to talk about with the trends in the states where you've been looking. And also, if you don't mind explaining for our listeners, what are those foreign agent laws? They're particularly, I think, prevalent in the region where you work, and would love to sort of hear more about that. And then, sort of talk maybe more specifically about European election standards and how they maybe align or depart or reinforce global standards.
No, thank you very much. And it's an interesting question. And I think very much what Julia said, that we're in a period of democratic decline and backsliding, is probably the major threat at the moment to credible and democratic elections. So the use by authoritarian states or even by less democratic states of legal frameworks and other measures to try to limit competition, to try to limit transparency, to try to limit integrity of elections sometimes is really, I think, the greatest challenge of these years. And it's a global trend, I would say. Initially, I would have said it was a European trend in the former Soviet Union, but it seems to be something that now has spread to most parts of the world. And I would underscore that this is really where international and regional standards come into their own. So like any type of law, especially international law, it's not for the good times, it's really for the bad times where there are, inconsistencies or conflicts, and to have a certain set of principles and values that people could adhere to and use as a sort of yardstick when those questions arise and when problems occur. And really, international standards have existed, for almost a century now. The post-war settlement put in very strong notions of credibility, periodic elections, openness, secrecy of the ballot, fairness, equity, universality, things of those nature. And they are really much echoed in European standards like the OSCE or the Council of Europe or the European Union later on. They're really there to buttress and give further weight to those international standards, which are more overarching. But in some cases, they can be more prescriptive and they can go further than the actual international standards. And a few points that I would mention is looking at a document like the OSCE Copenhagen document from the 1990s. Article 5.4 delineates a clear separation between the state and political parties. In particular, political parties will not be merged with the state. And at a certain point, that may have seemed outdated, but now looking at many electoral situations, we again see that kind of unification between state and party in many parts of the world. And so, a regional standard like that really becomes important to underscoring and being able to level criticism and recommendations on making changes that would allow the state to be really independent from any political forces. Another element is under Article 8, where participating states consider the presence of observers, both foreign and domestic, can enhance the electoral process. And there is an imperative in that article that they therefore invite observers from other participating states and from other private institutions and organizations. So it's codified in that standard that election observation, both international, but also by citizens of their own country, is an integral part of an integral election process. And I think these recent foreign agent laws really hit to the heart of that matter and try to circumvent that notion that, citizen involvement in their own elections, their ability to look at the process and report independently and transparently, is being limited by a raft of legislation, which initially started in the lobbying sector. So to try to limit the effect that lobbyists have on political life, which may be appropriate under circumstances, but then widening that to wider citizen participation is something which has been inappropriate and then used as a tool very often to limit that citizen observation, or sometimes even to arrest individuals or organizations and prevent them from doing the kind of work that international documents really see as being a foundation stone. And maybe lastly, to mention, a point like Istanbul, Article 25, where the states recognize that ODIHR can provide states in developing and implementing their electoral legislation. And they agree to follow up promptly on ODIHR recommendations and assessments. And this is another key regional, I think, standard, which really goes to the heart of making changes and the importance to the implementation of those recommendations in order to move electoral integrity forward. And that's really another foundation stone, I would say, of international election observation, but also citizen observation, to make sure that it's not just bringing up points of criticism and noting things which are wrong, but also providing a roadmap on how certain types of changes can lead to a better situation in the future.
Thank you for that. And for those of us listening who are not familiar with the acronym ODIHR, that is the acronym for the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights.
Correct.
And just adding, again, as a point of clarification for some of our listeners, that the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, consists of 57 participating states that include the United States, and we'll get to that in a minute. I'm hoping that perhaps both of you could also elaborate a bit on some of the standards around e-voting and election technology. Both of you, have some expertise in that, whether in other countries, and also if you have some thoughts about how that's been used or not used here in the US elections.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start and say that I think especially in this space, there is a feeling that the international framework has been rather limited in facing these new challenges, and that also guidance from organizations like the United Nations or other more global institutions may not be forthcoming in the immediate future. And so you've had a number of regional standards develop. For instance, the Council of Europe Recommendation 2017 on standards for e-voting. And this has really set much wider and more specific standards on electronic technology in elections, on electronic voting, on supporting technology than most other frameworks have had to date. One important element of that is that it specifically notes that election management bodies cannot abrogate responsibility for electoral integrity through the use of technology. And that's been a very important point in many discussions. In many countries where we observe EMBs or election management bodies try to point to vendors or technical suppliers and say, this really isn't our fault, this isn't our problem. But really, this kind of a standard brings back to the fore the responsibility that state institutions have for their electoral processes, and really, asks them to ensure that everything is in line with standards at the wider purview and take responsibility for that. This is something that's echoed, for instance, in ODIHR's recent Handbook on the Observation of Information and Communication Technologies, which was published in February this year. And it really seeks to understand how traditional standards like equality, universality, secrecy pertain in this new ICT space. it tries to translate many of those technical elements into that language of human rights standards. And I think it has some success in doing so. But it also includes important elements of things like ancillary systems. So issues like voter registration or results management systems, which also use technology in the election process. And the important question of cybersecurity, which is looming much larger now post 2016 than it had previously. And then lastly, I'll mention some groundbreaking, I think, EU legislation on the space of disinformation and artificial intelligence. And I think here the European Union has really been actively working to try to establish a more comprehensive regulatory framework in the digital space. This includes the very thorny issue of AI. And it's really in that anticipation of the absence of global regulations, which the EU sees in the near future. So, for instance, they've passed the Digital Services Act, which is directly applicable since February of this year. For the first time, this act unifies criteria for what are known as notice and action procedures, and it determines when and if online platforms should be held accountable for the dissemination of illegal content. So that's really very important in this space of disinformation and artificial intelligence spread of that disinfo. It's yet to be seen how it will be implemented. It's early days still, but I think it's an important piece of legislation to look at in the wider standards space. There is also a new regulation on the transparency and targeting of political advertising, which will take effect in 2025. But it builds on the EU Code of Practice Against Disinformation, which was updated in 2022. Unfortunately, that failed to solve many of the problems regarding political advertising, especially since it lacked independent third-party oversight. But this new TTPA, as it's called, seeks to put in more robust measures to try to especially tackle issues of political advertising, disinformation, and spread online. And maybe lastly, to mention the Artificial Intelligence Act. This was published in July of this year. Again, it's something which is not yet tested, but it's designed as a horizontal legislative instrument, which is going to be applicable to all AI systems placed on the market or used in the European Union. So I think another piece of legislation which is very important to look at in this wider standards space, and something that, gives further body to the GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, which has been extant since 2018. And really establishes key rights such as access to data, the right to erasure, the right to object to data processing, which are enjoyed by all EU citizens.
Thank you for that. Julia, did you want to add your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Beata really nailed it in terms of, I think we oftentimes, when faced with new technologies in elections or some of these more complex electoral integrity threats like disinformation or the introduction of Gen AI or, online political advertising and all these things, they can feel a little overwhelming. But, a lot of the standards and regulations that are being developed now, we already have these fundamental principles that they should be rooted in and that they do lean on. Any new technology needs to still meet these standards of transparency, right? Needs to be accountable. So that means there needs to be some sort of auditability. The procurement process needs to be transparent. They need to protect the secrecy of the ballot. We still have these standards in which all of these things should be really rooted in. So we don't necessarily need to create entirely new ones, but we need to probably clarify, right? And build in more detail. Same thing with disinformation. I think there's always like, we're not ready for this. And, we do have standards, freedom of expression and the right to access and impart information and the right to form and hold an opinion free from coercion and manipulation. Those already exist in General Comment 25. So, I think always thinking about where we can sort of pull from these fundamental standards first and sort of build around that.
Thank you for that. Yes, I think we have the basic principles, but we just have new, changing, constantly evolving conditions that we have to adapt and update to. Beata, given your work with the OSCE, as you mentioned, the OSCE's Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, was invited to serve as an election observer at this US election that we just had on November 5th. And this is the 11th time that they've come since 2002 to the US to conduct such an observation. It seems that overall, the impression from that observation, which would be considered an international observation mission in the US, their observation was that the election demonstrated, and I'm quoting, the resilience of the US, the country's democratic institutions with a well-run process in a highly polarized environment, candidates campaigning freely across the country, and voter engaging actively. And quote, it did add that the campaign was marked by disinformation and instances of violence. There are a few other things that preliminary report highlights. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that observation mission, including some of the areas where it seems the US may have fallen short of international standards.
Yeah, I think it's important to underscore, as you say, that this is the 11th election observation activity that the OSCE ODIHR has conducted in the United States, and that the United States is a full participating state of the OSCE framework. And that's something which I think a lot of US citizens don't understand. And so in the past, there have been certain allegations that international observation is inappropriate or that it's foreign interference, something that we also hear in other parts of the world, unfortunately. But it's an aspect that has been agreed to by the United States as a founding member of the organization. And it's very good to see that this open invitation continues to stand and that these kinds of observations and findings and conclusions can be publicly voiced. And so I do think that the ODIHR report notes many positive aspects of the election. It noted the resilience of the country's democratic institutions, and I think that's very important to further challenges that may be faced in the United States. It also noted that it was a well-run election administration process in a very highly polarized environment. And that's also important to keep in mind, since in many countries, that lack of a well-run process is something which becomes a complicating factor when politicians seek to politicize the election process. And as you mentioned, candidates did campaign freely across the country. Voters engaged actively in the process, but the campaign was fraught and marked by disinformation, which is a challenge that needs to be thought about more explicitly in the future, maybe including by looking at some of these evolving regional standards on aspects that I mentioned. There was also note that there had been repeated and unfounded claims about election fraud, which negatively impacts public trust. And that's another key element that has been used in many countries abroad to say that, if I have lost the election, therefore the elections were fraudulent, without presenting any evidence or without presenting due cause. Another element that was criticized was that women remain significantly underrepresented as candidates and in high elected office. And that's another aspect that will need to be thought about and dealt with forthrightly, I think, in the future. For a democratic country with such a history, it's a little bit unfortunate that women are so underrepresented when you compare that with some other countries around the world. But as you mentioned, perhaps most significantly, the ODIHR report mentioned that there had been no other legislative changes at the federal level since the last election, and that the majority of previous ODIHR recommendations remain unaddressed. This really echoes a fundamental problem across many countries, namely that for election observation to have maximal impact, it's necessary for these recommendations to be properly considered and to be implemented in that election cycle in between elections. As I mentioned before, states have committed to this under the Istanbul Agreement. And so really there are additional efforts needed to be put into the space, and especially the political will found to make the changes necessary. Sometimes these changes are difficult. I don't have any illusions that the legislative process in the United States, like in many countries, is a difficult one to tackle, including in having the majorities necessary to even pass the kind of measures that are needed. But that doesn't exclude from having a robust and in-depth discussion in including various citizens and organizations that are involved in the process and really have thoughts of their own that they could contribute, and to have a continuous sort of movement forward, even if those recommendations may take time and may take effort to implement. That is the roadmap that should be looked at. And the idea of international observation is really to make those points, but then to provide that kind of path forward so that we're not making the same comments every time we turn up.
That's right. Thank you for that extensive overview. Another thing that stood out to me from what you were saying and from that preliminary report was an observation around the record high spending in this election. And that also has sort of spotlighted the need to regulate financial contribution in that process. Also wanted to just tease out one other thing that you just said, Beata, about women's representation, which in the US now, it's about 28% of congressional seats and 32% in state legislatures, and point out that the UN committee that oversees the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, just in October issued a new general recommendation on women's rights to equal and inclusive representation, where they actually call on states to implement a 50-50 parity rule as a starting point and as a universal norm. So it'll be interesting to see how states take that on, as that is by definition sort of an emerging standard as CEDAW has put forth. I wanted to wrap us up and have you each have the floor for your thoughts, recommendations, or other missives. We'll start with Julia and end with Beata.
Thanks. Yeah. I think one thing about the ODIHR report that is always a little telling is some of these structural issues, right, that are kind of just baked into the US system, malapportionment in the Electoral College, which does create different sort of voting power across the US. But also one thing that I always appreciate that they flag is the DC disenfranchisement, which I do think is a very obvious failure to meet international standards in the United States that we sort of just accept. So I think that it's important to always to get that international perspective that this isn't normal to just have, loss of the population, of tax-paying citizens that are not represented. But I would say, I think looking forward both in the US, but around the world, one thing that we do know and one thing that we've learned from this year is that citizens will always be the greatest electoral integrity safeguard. This is particularly important in places where you're dealing with low credibility media or where media is captured by the government. But the work of citizens as advocates, but also as election observers in their own countries, is the last line of defense for electoral integrity. And for that reason, we're also seeing that citizen observers in particular, but also international observers, are under threat more than they have been since the third wave of democracy. We're seeing, offices be raided. Again, there are these restrictive, legal restrictions that are being applied to observer groups that have never, really been applied before. Credible groups not receiving accreditation to observe. And people are being put in jail and people are being detained. There are political prisoners across the world now that are all just nonpartisan citizen observers. We're seeing violence. We're seeing increased harassment, especially towards women, civil society leaders that are working in this space. So it's something that, we at NDI are looking at really closely and want to make sure that we're kind of ringing the alarm on, because again, this is really how we protect electoral integrity in the long run.
Great. From my side, I just want to underscore that there has been a considerable amount done over the last nearly 2 decades of election observation. And I think it really has been a very fruitful exercise to empower those international standards, to have citizens in different countries understand how they pertain to their national legislation, and to try to advocate for change in their own country so that those election processes in the future can be more representative and more genuine. Despite this, there are still significant areas for improvement. And as I mentioned in the previous answers, observer recommendations really need to be implemented for election observation to have full impact. It's a comprehensive exercise where the findings are the initial step, but the implementation is what's going to be really necessary for things to move forward. And organizations around the world are willing to work with states on important issues of follow-up, but the political will for this really needs to exist. There needs to be a genuine desire to move forward with democracy in situ and to empower citizens to have a real voice in their own societies. And then, as I mentioned, there's a whole raft of new challenges emerging that are really going to test these international and regional standards and really ask us to expand out our notions. So I mentioned some of the spaces of ICT, of e-voting, of ancillary systems, of cybersecurity, disinformation, and AI. All of these will be challenges in the future, but they're all challenges which are fundamentally based in principles and standards which are already developed in the human rights space and just need to be further defined in this new technology framework. And these are issues which the international community is already thinking about and ready to meet these challenges. So a space that really needs to be more considered and further worked on.
Thank you to both of you. This has been a fascinating discussion. And for those of you listening who want to learn more about some of those global election and electoral standards, the DC Bar International Law Community webpage has a list of resources and links to both the documents and to organizations that can provide more information. Thank you, everyone, and let's keep on.
This episode of Brief Encounters has been brought to you in part by our sponsors, LawPay, MyCase, and CasePeer. Learn more about these solutions in the description of this episode.